here in South Florida. I'm based out of Fort Myers, and I've been working down there for about 22 years at this point. It keeps growing every year. I'm also currently the president of the Florida Anthropological Society, which is the organization that creates or assists in creating those Florida Archaeology Month materials every year. We have a partnership between the Florida Anthropological Society and the Florida Public Archaeology Network, the Department of State, as well as the Archaeological Council, to craft a theme and try to get the public interested in various components of Florida's past through those materials. But I wasn't invited, I think, for either of those two reasons today, or at least that's my assumption. Ted and Steve, who I know well, will likely tell me if I'm wrong. A few years ago, in 2014, the state of Florida was commemorating Viva Florida, 500 years since Juan Ponce de Leon came to Florida and christened La Florida. And the commemoration wording, or the rhetoric, was very closely tied to attempting to celebrate or commemorate all of the diverse facets of Florida history, dating back to the earliest archaeological sites that we have here in Florida, which are at least 14,500 years old. But because of the tie to the anniversary of European exploration and colonization efforts in Florida, even though there was other programming and carefully worded language, that commemoration of all of Florida's cultural history became very strongly tied to just the last 500 years, and in particular to the earliest European encounters and explorations, and more of a celebration of colonialism than what it was actually intended to be, which was a vehicle for conversation. As an archaeologist in South Florida, that bothered me. And so I worked with Steve and Ted at that time to create an art exhibit called Art Calusa. So it was focused on the Calusa Indians, just a little south of here on the coast. And we brought together all of the artists in the state of Florida that I knew at the time, there were 9 of them, that had visually represented indigenous peoples in Florida's history, particularly the Calusa, and then we also went back in time to the earliest inhabitants of Florida, so Paleo-Indian time period and also the Archaic. We then held a forum. This is a small snapshot of that, with half of those artists, so 4 of those artists, and 4 very well-known archaeologists, who then had a conversation in public about the archaeology of Florida and also how we represent past societies. What are the ways, what are the things that we know that can be put in a painting? And what is it that we don't actually know that is truly artistic license in the creation of these images? Unbeknownst to me at the time that we did this art exhibit, which ultimately toured for 3 years, and we just closed down last year, I think. This had never happened before. Certainly artists like Ted Morris had sought out archaeologists, had attended multiple presentations by organizations such as this, did very careful research of the archaeological literature, ran his ideas for what would or would not be appropriate through various artists, or excuse me, various archaeologists. But there had not been a public conversation between archaeologists and artists about how we actually represent Florida's indigenous peoples. There's also, or there was also what came out of that first forum, a notion that both entities felt that the other were responsible for the creation of that imagery. So archaeologists do their scientific analysis. We dig in the ground, or we study in museum collections, and we publish reports of our interpretation of the past, our inferences about the past. So we're not creating those images. And the artists, and I interviewed Ted after that forum, and at one point I asked him, who is it that educates people about the past? And he said, well, not me. I'm just taking what other people find and adding flesh to that scientific skeleton to create a visual to help people understand the significance of Florida's prehistoric peoples. And so both of these two groups were not claiming responsibility or culpability about the imagery, and yet both were integral to its integration. And so we'll explore a little bit about that today. I'm going to mention one other thing before I actually introduce these two gentlemen a little bit more, let them, since I had to do it, let them introduce themselves. One is that we want this very much to be a conversation. So there are pads and pencils at the corner table back here and also at the back of the room. So if you want to jot down notes, you have this available to you. If you want to ask a question of the panel, we encourage you to write it down. We may stop at various points and ask for questions, but you can also turn those in to Bill, who's going to pass them up to me so that we can integrate them into the conversation.
And they can do that by just raising their hand if you would like a pad and paper cut.
Get a good one.
And so the last thing I want to mention, when I was talking to Bill the other day, I was asking him what my obligations were today. We were having a conversation about this notion of how people, not archaeologists, not artists, but how the general public interfaces with the past and how we learn information about the past. And I mentioned to Bill that I had worked with an exhibit design company. I developed a museum facility down in Lee County that was archaeologically and historically themed. And we had an exhibit company that sadly did not survive the economic downturn. They were fantastically talented, but relatively small. But I will never forget that the president of the company, this woman, Mary Frances Turner, said to me that there are three kinds of people who visit museums. There are streakers, strollers, and studiers. Studiers, we probably have a high percentage of studiers in the room today. I imagine that all three of us on the panel are studiers. I imagine Bill is a studier. I imagine Rob Bendis is a studier. We're the people who go to a museum exhibit and read everything. We may go back multiple times if we run out of time, but ultimately we're interested in the content and the messaging of every written word that's provided to us. We're about 5% of the visitation of museums. 95% are streakers and strollers. Strollers come in and will read the titles, the big titles. They'll usually read the first paragraph of every interpretive exhibit. They'll usually read all figure captions. And if you hook them, they might read more. But for those of us who spend 3 hours in one museum, they're the people spending half an hour. And then you have the streakers, who are going to read the big picture type and are going to look at the pictures. And they're done in 5 minutes, and they're at the gift store waiting for their significant other who's wandering through the museum in one of the other two bags. And so visual imagery, because 95% of the people who visit museums are learning most of their content from the graphics that they see, the power of the artwork that's embedded in those interpretive panels it's more significant than those of us who are studiers that are usually writing the content and laboring over every word give it credit for. We're not reaching as many people through our text as we are through the images. And that means that having conversations about what the art can reflect about the past, what is it that we can actually know that can be incorporated in a painting, becomes important information to share, because otherwise people will see and assume that everything that's in a painting or an illustration is known factual information. And as you'll hear from both Ted and Steve through their various stories, that is not correct. That's not a correct assumption. Because both of us from opposite sides are claiming that we're not the ones responsible for relaying that information to the public. And so we're both wrong, and we're both right at the same time. So I want to introduce Steve Koski first. And I'll just quickly mention a couple of things about Steve. I know too much about Steve. So Steve's lucky that I have a limited time. Steve Koski is currently the archaeologist for Sarasota County, and so you can find him at the History Center on most days. Is that correct?
Yes.
But he comes from a long tradition of doing underwater archaeological research in Florida, in particular at Little Salt Spring, which is down in Northport. And I bring that up by way of introducing Steve and his long archaeological background, because I want Steve to introduce himself and talk specifically about his time at Little Salt Spring, and also how a particular iconic image there has crafted public impressions about the prehistory of the spring that doesn't have direct scientific basis. Turn it over to you.
Cover it.
Thank you, Teresa. I was very flattered and honored to be asked to write a little something in Teresa's catalog for Art Calusa. And I really didn't know what I was going to say, and it took me a little while to figure it out in terms of what Art Calusa was and where it was going. And it took me a little while of studying to figure out that what it meant to me, and I didn't really, I'm still trying to find my artistic outlet, which I don't know if I have yet, but maybe photography. But so I began to think about, what artists do and start talking to artists, and artists, where do they get their information from, and how do they represent what they know? And so reading some of the drafts, I learned that Ted has done great studies of archaeology, and he's visited archaeological sites, and he listens, and through that listening of what the archaeologists say about how they interpret sites, they then develop these representations, and those representations combine imagination in their creative talent to come up. So there's a lot of mental visualization on what they've learned from talking with archaeologists and being in the field. And so they bridge the gap between sort of the past and the present, and can help bring the past into the present. And that's something that archaeologists can have a tendency to put the general public to sleep, because they don't really, because everything is so technical and descriptive, where artists then bring it alive through the work that they do. And it brought me to where for the chapter that I wrote in this little book, and by the way, they will be available here for a reasonable cost that talks about Art Calusa and all the artists that were involved, including Theodore as well as many others. But it brought me back to a scene that was represented very often of the 90-foot ledge in Little Salt Spring, and the interpretation that came out in 1975 of Carl Clausen working on that 90-foot ledge and finding an extinct tortoise upside down with a sharpened spear through its plasteron and carapace. And through that archaeological interpretation, there were multiple representations by artists. The first was by Merrill Clark, who actually worked on the tortoise with Carl Clausen. And then there was Herman Trapman, who did his imaginary concept based on that interpretation, and had several Paleo-Indians on the ledge dancing with full regalia and things, as if it were an actual event. And then there was Steve Daniels, who did the famous profile of Little Salt Spring that you can see in this room. And he did one of the sort of the most basic elemental, where there's a Paleo-Indian standing over this upside down, funny looking tortoise with a spear. And it was so one of the first representations by Merrill Clark and then by Steve Daniels. And then Dean Quigley did another one, and Dean Quigley's print is available here. And so I wrote this little chapter about my representative explanation in how the Paleo-Indian bent over to the spooky ledge and slipped in and fell and came to the bottom and landed in the water and then swam to the edge and then found himself in the bowels of the underworld. And so that sort of inspired me to write that little essay, that little 2 or 3 page essay. And it was quite a learning experience for me because it brought me into the realm of how artists, what's the next step and how we can do those things. So that was kind of a fun thing.
So Steve, what do we actually know about the tortoise at the bottom of Little Salt Spring? Scientifically, what information is available?
The information that's available is that there was a discovery of a giant tortoise upside down on the ledge, and in between when you remove the plasteron and carapace, there was a tapered wooden item that was between the plasteron and carapace, and that archaeological analysis, ethnobotany discovered that paleobotany discovered that was made out of red mulberry, and red mulberry still grows around the spring today. So that kind of connection, and that red mulberry stake dated to 12,030 plus or minus 80 radiocarbon years BP, which is almost 14,000 calendrical years, calibrated years BP. So here we have a 14,000-year-old tapered item believed to be an artifact stuck in the plasteron. Carl Clausen then came and, well, as he was excavating, and I know 2 other people that were involved in that excavation. One was Skip Wood, who I worked at Warm Mineral Springs with, and I asked him, Skip, do you really believe that was an artifact? And he said, yes, absolutely, no question about it. So I have a tendency to believe him. Carl also found charcoal on the ledge associated, and there was some blackening of the carapace of the tortoise that he interpreted as being burnt. So what he got out of that, his interpretation, was that the tortoise was actually killed in place and eaten. So then the next step for the artist who might read that, to think, wow, they create a visual scene and then they express that scene through their art. So that's where the representation comes in. So all these paintings, all the paintings in this catalog are based on sort of the mind that is allowed to sort of then fluoresce based on that description. So talk to anybody, talk to an archaeologist and have him discuss about the artifacts, or see, some of the artifacts, many of the artifacts that are depicted in Ted's paintings are actual artifacts that were found on excavation. So he brings those to life. So the artist can then take that interpretation and bring it to reality, but is that reality real? In my closing statement on the essay that I wrote was that what is he still there? Is Paleo Man still on that ledge? And then the closing statement was he ever? And it's just this, is who's real? Who's more real? The interpretation or the representation of that interpretation? So And we don't know. In 2008 to 2011, 2008, 2009, with the National Geographic grant, we went and we re-excavated some of those areas, and we did find tortoise. We did find more mulberry. We did find a palmetto frag that dated to 12,300, but we didn't find any more artifacts. But then on the north side, we found 2 more tortoises and 2 more sharpened items that dated later. So it's still up in the air. You would think that if Herman Chapman's depiction were true, you would find many more other artifacts. If Steve Daniels' interpretation, in my essay on Steve Daniels, was that there may have been 1 person there, you may not have many artifacts, but that person might still be there unless he was rescued or unless he found a way to crawl out.
Did that answer your question?
It was a little more than what I was going for.
But that's not uncommon for Steve.
No more light for me.
So Ted, why don't you talk a little bit about why you decided to start depicting the indigenous people in Florida? What was it in your background that led you to the moment in 1987 when you decided that this was going to be an important cause for you?
And what was his first one?
Right there's the first one. The Birdman Dancer, Appalachian tribe, Northeast Florida. And what I brought along is some comments from an archaeologist as I was painting this, saying, yeah, you gotta change that, that's the wrong color, you gotta move that, like that. So I'll go over those with you later, but as far as why I got into it, I've always liked history, and of course I always liked art. And at one point in my life I decided to do something that had some meaning instead of advertising. And so I got into it, and I think one influence was, I was a medic in Vietnam in '68, and we saw how an army that was, had a lot of technology just plowed right through the indigenous people here, and the same thing was going on in Vietnam. So maybe that connection too. But anyway, I just wanted to bring them back to life, and that's about it, really.
That's about it. Can you talk a little bit about the process you take? So
Yes.
obviously you want to use that first one as an example. What was it that you did in terms of research to come up with that first image?
Okay, as you see over here, I worked with George Lurger, who's a local archaeologist that's very well known throughout Florida, and other archaeologists. Anyway, this is off a copper plate in a burial in Tallahassee area. So we decided to do a poster as a fundraiser for the FAS, Florida Anthropology Society. So that became this, and it was like back and forth, what does that mean, what does that mean? So one day I walked by this, I said, I wonder what it would look like as a painting. So I started this. And I will tell you now, maybe we'll do this later if you have your energy. Okay, so I was working with one archaeologist, or this is one archaeologist, I was working with a bunch of them. But this is dated January 24th, 1994. I received your card and a copy of the painting you are doing. I do have a few suggestions, most of which are based on archaeological information. I will list them below, there's 10 paragraphs. Okay, I'll do these fast. I suggest that the handle of the wood base, down here, down there, this is the base, was covered with copper. At the Taste Mountain in Citrus County, we found that we think is part of one of these, and it's made of cypress wood covered with sheet copper. All we found was the handlebar, which means the large bar was not copper covered. Copper tends to preserve organic material with which it is contact. It was round cross-section, not flat, and had a peg carved on the handle, and to which was tied either cordage or human hair, and it's way down the bottom. So I put that in. So this is how archaeologists, just kind of like push me along in the right direction. And then concerning the Ogi symbol, which is this eye here, on the head, I would make the Ogi yourself more eye-shaped, see enclosed photocopy. As far as the features are concerned, I have no problem with the red feathers. They could have come from cardinals or woodpeckers, or the blue feathers, which could have come from blue jays. The blue-green ones, however, are a problem. I don't know of any birds in Florida that have the color of these Floridas. I'm thinking that maybe they could dye feathers, any color they wanted to. So I left it there. You might want to consider making a forelock, which is this guy right here, hair with beads in it. Forelock of hair composed of less hair and large shell beads strung on it. The fish should almost always have a beaded forelock on the dancer. The bilobe arrow, we're up here now. The bilobe arrow on the back of the head was probably made of copper or copper or wood. I don't recall ever seeing any that had been recovered archaeologically, but some may have been. You may want to add an arrowhead-shaped piece on the end, as often depicted in CD close photocopy, that guy right there. You might want to slightly alter the head rattle. Head rattle is right there. And probably made of copper and wood. And it could have been actual heads too. You know, I left it that way. I don't recall ever seeing any that had been recovered archaeologically. I don't think. I'm sorry. Close the article by Lou Larson describes one of these excavated at. There was missed one here, missed one. Anyway, he was saying that he didn't know if any blue paint was used on here. And so later, this is February 3rd, 1900. I want to thank you for the great card you sent me, and I stand corrected about the blue pigment. You're absolutely correct. I look forward to seeing final products.
Wow.
So that shows that he's more worried about getting it right rather than ego. This is Jeffrey Mitchell, by the way. Okay. Moving back to the dancer's head, what is the copper thing curved around from behind the head to just beneath the ear? And that was earlier. As in the Taste Island, we found a burial with a copper ear sprill on the right ear and copper plume ornament lying on the right shoulder, which is the ear. We assume that the plume was actually worn in the hair, probably somewhere in the back of the head, and tragedy it now appears that the burial was a female. Oops. I have no problem with other stuff. I hope this helps. If you have additional questions, please contact me. Sincerely, Jeff Mitchum, Jeffrey Mitchum, Station Archaeologist, Park and Archaeological State Park. And so that was part of the back and forth that I got to archaeologists, which was great. And I do have this sheet that I thought I might want to read, but it's this is edited by, it's a poem called That Birdman. And it's edited by Evan Johnson in Black Creek during the 1940s and 50s when she was asked the meaning and drawing of a copper breastplate in her home, recorded by J.R. Reynolds, Jacksonville, Florida, 1958. I was going to have Teresa take a shot at it since she's a woman and this is a woman. I'll do it real quick. It's like really heavy accented. It's the hawkman come with me fettered robe for to bear me child away. He fly me to them ceiling high, in the stars he gonna stay. That turtle man, he dived the mud, sprang it out in a day. He taught his pilgrims now to swim under the Father's eye, they say. He broke his back with a wicked word, cracked that shell with them evil ways. But the hawkman from with them feathered robe for to be me child away, bear my child away. Done look my boy from this turtle island, done put them their father's eye. Can't call that chill my name no more, can't call him down from the sky. But brethren got him in his hand, gonna get us all by and by. Gonna take us off to this turtle land, Hawkman takes us when we die. Opa hoots on them dark soul nights, that bird has got a lonesome cry. He calls for the Hawkman in that robe, for to bring us to the sky. And it's a Lichka, whatever that means. Now, I'll say the translation real quickly, because the two-part. The hawkwind came with feathered robe to bear my child away. He flown now to the heavens high, in the stars he's going to stay. The turtle man, he dived from the mud, for the mud, he spread it out in a day. He taught us pilgrims how to swim under the Father's eye, they say. We broke his back with a wicked word, cracked the shell with those evil ways. But the hawkwind came with feathered robe, to bear my child away. Took my boy from this turtle land, he put him in Father's eye. I can't call that child by name anymore, can't call him down from the sky. The master of breath has him in his hand, he'll take us all by and by. He'll take us off this turtle land, hawkwind takes us when we die. Owl hoots in the dark night, that bird has a lonesome cry. He calls for the hawkman in a feathered robe to take us to the sky. That's it.
So there's a lot of content in there. I noticed a couple, I'll just make a couple of comments and then turn it back to, I think, Steve for some commentary. So Jeff Mitchum, who's an archaeologist who works in Florida, but he's based in Arkansas these days at Parkin Archaeological Site, was going back and forth about very specific points of the artifacts that are depicted, recognizing that in most cases we do not find or recover multiple copies of the same object. So he's making reference to a particular object that has been recovered and is working with Ted to redirect his artwork to more accurately illustrate a single object in the past. And I think that that's an interesting element here, because scientifically we look at our mindset is to look at what is tangible, what is knowable, what can be measured, observed, and then to relate those very specific details to someone who's then going to be using artistic license to craft an entire painting. When I look at Ted's painting, 90% or more of what's illustrated is not going to fit into that tangible category. And so it's interesting to me that there's 10 very specific items about the color of feathers and how they might relate to a particular bird, or the whether or not a portion of an artifact has been wrapped in copper, or the shape of a particular element of a mask, or the color of a pigment that can be created. I would have asked Ted all sorts of other questions about what is the intended meaning that you're trying to emulate about this individual? What is your reference point for how the person looks physically? What do we know about the Appalachee as a group in terms of their behaviors that would suggest that, like, who is this person that you're trying to show? And those questions are much harder to answer because scientifically we can't necessarily address those particular points.
And of course, I wouldn't want to anyway.
The other thing that I'll just mention briefly is the poem that Ted just recited is an oral record, an oral tradition. And oftentimes, and I think it's changing now, but in the past, archaeologists and anthropologists haven't necessarily given as much credence to oral tradition as is appropriately due. Archaeology is a scientific methodology that's born out of Western culture, whereas orally told stories are a method of remembering the past and commemorating certain events that isn't necessarily part of that same scientific tradition. And so we look at information with more scrutiny. And I think that there's some interesting telling in that poem about what the meaning behind this representation could be that science can't possibly address directly. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you for some of your comments on.
When you think of what artists do compared to what archaeologists do. Archaeologists are very focused and sometimes very, what do they call those things horses wear? Blinders.
Oh, blinders.
Or whatever, I mean, there's something specific word that I can't think of. But archaeologists are very in the dirt, and while I'm underwater, or I'm in a shell mid, or I'm on land, I try to think of, okay, what is it like? What was it like for these people? It's very difficult for us to think about what these people were like when your head is literally in the ground and in the dirt. Now you take it out of the dirt, you bring it into the lab, and then you do the analysis on the age and the artifact, and you try to think about the function of the artifact from the form, and is it utilitarian, is it ceremonial? So all these things are we're very limited and constricted to what we can think and do and even say. So we're using scientific techniques to sort of tease out this information. And then the information that we get many times is in a technical report or sometimes in a descriptive chapter that may be for a university or maybe for students or maybe for the general public. But we don't really recreate the vision. So the artist takes that and then brings it to life. So they sort of bring what we do by their thinking, and through imagination and representation can bring that to life that we can't do. I mean, some archaeologists are much better at explaining the story. The artist is much better at visualizing the story. But which story is more accurate is the question. Is the archaeologist's interpretation any more real than the artist's interpretation or representation? Not always, and not necessarily. And so can we as archaeologists invoke as much feeling, as much emotion about the past and as much interest in the past? So I think it's very important that the artist can combine those two to help with us. We may not take credit. We don't take credit for the artist. They don't take credit for us. But so that it's not really middle range theory, but it helps bring that. It bridges the gap to reality. And is my reality any more real than Ted's reality? I would think not. In fact, Ted has an ability to then create a reality that then may help me with research. It may help archaeologists with research that they do, because it's difficult to think about people when you're in the dirt. Even though we are investigating people, it's difficult to imagine the people there. We try, when I'm underwater and on the tortoise, I'm thinking, okay, what was it like when I find a throwing stick in the basin, or a pendant in a shell mid, or a greenstone pendant? It's like, okay, who left it here? And what does it mean to that culture? And what Teresa was saying is, how can you get that from artifact to person? And then how can you get to what that person is thinking and feeling and doing? These depictions help imagine or help bring us to think about what these people are doing.
Well, I think that's a great segue, because one of the things that's really interesting to me about the artwork is how identity is crafted. So Ted, what makes one of your paintings a painting of an Appalachee versus a painting of the Calusa versus a painting of Timucua? What is it for you that crafts a different identity among the various tribes of Florida, of which you've attempted to illustrate through your artwork, or represent through your artwork, many of the different tribes in Florida?
Well, actually, it's very simple. The artifacts that were found in certain areas of the tribal lands, that were once the tribal lands, that's how I determined who they were. So it's just basically doing the body and then using all the information I can gather to kind of load him up, or load her up with the artifacts, and design for tattoos or body painting. And of course, I stay away from spirituality. I do not describe anything here culturally. I usually don't show them doing things. I just want to paint portraits and bring them back to life. And also to use what archaeologists have given us so that people can really look at the artifacts and say, wow, that is really cool. I wonder where that came from. So I think that answers the question.
It does, it answered it perfectly. So Ted and I have had this conversation before, and I think that that's a really interesting aspect of this concept that identity in the past comes down to artifact. Whereas if we were to ask anyone in this room how you identify yourself, would it be your possessions? Or would it really be something different? Maybe your heritage, where you grew up, or how you grew up, or the way you interface with the world is how we think about identity in our own modern world. And yet, because archaeology is a science that analyzes or assesses human behavior based on the material remains of that behavior, that's the definition of archaeology, is that we study human behavior in the past or present based on the material that is left behind. So in Ted's case, as an artist, he takes that same mantra of archaeology and then fleshes it out to create an identity for an indigenous people that's based again on the material record that's left behind. And I think that that's an important thing to recognize, because I'm not sure if that is what is the first impression when people look at artwork, is the objects that are there, because there's so much going on. And I'd be curious, for those of you with your pads of paper, or anybody who wants to weigh in, what it is that captivates you first from an imagery, from any one of the paintings. Is it the actual artifacts that have gone through this rigorous process of Ted crafting a painting and then sending it away to an archaeologist who's saying, oh no, that handle should be wrapped in copper? Is that the message that is coming back through the painting to someone that's observing it in this kind of a setting? You something else.
Well, we got some time.
Well, we have some time, yeah.
Somebody else is gonna have to talk, or someone else is gonna have to raise their hand.
Yeah, let's have some questions.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so I'll just, do you want to say it yourself, or do you want me to read it? I see a string of pearls. How did an Indian drill the holes? How much effort was expended to make a single necklace? Seems like a lot of unproductive effort for a hunter-gatherer population. Were pearls available in Florida? Oh, that's interesting. So first, Ted, are they pearls?
Actually, I've got one here. Anyway, he was saying, actually, for some reason, it's not on there. Anyway, he was talking about the pearls. Said the freshwater pearls are usually not round; they're kind of oblong or different shaped. And so you got the regular pearls from the ocean, and you got freshwater pearls. The ones from the ocean, of course, are more round. So I can go either way. I can say they're pearls if they're round. If they're oblong, I can say they're fresh pearls. And if they're long and round, I can say they're shell. That's it.
Well, and that's interesting, because I never assumed that they were pearls. I assumed that they were the central columella of shells. But to answer your...
You have to read the little board on the side.
Oh, does the board say they're pearls?
Whatever it says.
But okay, so this is great, right? It illustrates the point. So if you walk away from the painting seeing pearls, your impression is that there are pearls in Florida. And and there are pearls in Florida, but not in great abundance like, say, on the coast of California or the Gulf of California. So I think that's an interesting facet. But there's a number of other questions in here about how much effort was expended to make the necklace that I think this is an excellent question about how much effort a hunting and gathering population might expend on ornaments, personal ornaments. Steve, do you want to talk about that?
This is really good because for Mike, looking at a piece of work like that made him start thinking about technology and how people made things. And so that brought him off in another area. It wasn't just the art. Now he's focusing in. And I know many times the shell pendant at Little Salt Spring was only drilled through one side. The greenstone pendant was drilled through both sides, and you can tell how because of the conical shape of the shell pendant. It goes right through. On the greenstone pendant, you can see the conical on both sides, and then splitting and breaking bone. The technique for cutting deer antler and bone would be to cut it all around and then snap it when it gets in there. And so there are many different techniques, and archaeologists think about technique of manufacture, procurement, use wear, use discard, how an artifact goes from being a certain thing and through its life it changes until you go take a knife. It's hafted on a bone or a wooden shaft. Through the use life of that knife, just like a metal knife, you sharpen it through pressure flaking, sometimes percussion. That knife gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it can't be used for its initial function. And then you use it for other things. You can now round off the point and use it as a scraper. Now you're scraping the corners of hides. So archaeologists think of that all the time, and they find a point, a little short point, and they say, oh, that's and they'll categorize that as a specific type, when actually it's just a nubbin from a Noonan point that was made that was really this big, and then through its use life it's got this big, and then it gets tossed or lost, and then it's like, oh, and then they look like two different types of points, maybe with the same base or something. And that happens, I think, a lot with shell tools because of the reduction in use. So procurement, manufacture, use, discard, incidental, intentional, grave good, those are all things that come into play. That when you look at something, it's like, well, how did they drill those holes and how did they draft it? I mean, I don't think we realize that 9,000 years ago, they could weave shirts almost as fine as this. And we only visually see 3% of the archaeological assemblage, depending on where you find it and how you find it. Now in wet sites, in archaeological wet sites, Little Salt Spring, you can get brain tissue, you can get tissue, you can get wood, you can get small incisions and carvings on wood, you can get some type of artwork. These are all things that you think about, and this helps you start thinking about it. And another thing that Mike said was what, talking about time. We're using our paradigm in our existence now. It took me 55 minutes to get here. I mean, oh man, that's all real, the traffic. Well, what if you were walking? What if you were in your canoe? You would have planned that many days to get here. So our whole concept of time and do things and what time means is different. Did that type of time affect the biology? Certainly time is only constant in an hourglass or something. There's all types of dimensions to time, biological time. What we do as individuals affect our length of time on Earth. So I think the good point is time and how we think of time now. We're using our Western paradigm of time. Oh my God, what time is that? I gotta be somewhere. What's this test? We're so rushed. It affects our time. It affects our physiology. Maybe it is, boy, I'm gonna just sit here and carve these beads out. And then those beads, I'm gonna be able to use the time that I made those beads. It may take me a week, but I'll have those packs of beads with me. And when I've got nothing to do, I'll just make them, and then when they're done, I've made value, and those beads have value to me, and I can give that value. And they've been in this pouch so long, they now have magic because they are me. They have absorbed my essence. Now, we can't get to that archaeologically, but we can get it sometimes through ethnohistory. And what did the Spanish think? What did the French think about the chalk ponds, Chickasaw? When they actually witnessed the priest come out, turn his hands up in the air, and the villagers, the stinkers around would hoot 3 times and wait for him to raise the sun. And then the sun raises, and they all thank the chief for bringing up the sun today. What if the sun doesn't rise? What if there's a hurricane? The chief could be in deep doo-doo. So if he takes credit for the universe, and the universe does them bad, they don't get the crops this year. It's your fault. You're the one that brought the crops. You're the one that brought this. Or the neighbors. It was their fault. No, it wasn't my fault. It was their fault. So those are all things that you can get through ethnohistory, and that goes from time to how we know what we know and why we know it. And do we know what we know? Does it have anything to do with reality? And sometimes maybe not. Sometimes our reality is so different from them, we have no concept of how we can get in their heads, but then we still try.
I have a question.
That was great.
What exactly tools would they use to drill into a pearl? I mean, is there some kind of shaft or, what stand in it?
There are little microliths, little tiny flakes that points can be turned into drills depending on the type of hole. Fossilized shark's teeth could be used. Little flakes sharpened on both sides. Microlithic drills. There's a whole. I worked on I-4 in Salford, north of the St. Johns River, in an archaic shell midden, and it was full of tiny little drills and broken beads and small beads. So it was a bead manufacturing workshop in the late archaic, ACI, 1996, or somewhere around there. I don't know time. I'm having trouble with time lately. But so there are all kinds of things, different tools for different uses. And I'll tell the kids if I'm doing a tour. Everything in your mother's kitchen, everything in your father's toolbox, some are represented some way in the it may not be in the archaeological record, but in the active record. So the active context, while it's still going on, the systemic context of the artifacts, they had all this stuff. And we're like digging in the dirt, finding these little things that they'd laugh at us. Oh man, it must be ceremonial. But, so, yeah. Lots of stuff, lots of drills. There are many different types of drills.
So I want to go to a slightly different part of the point that question brought up, which is the idea of time among hunting and gathering populations. As anthropology developed as an outgrowth of the Western scientific tradition, by the time anthropology was an actual discipline, we were in the very late 1800s, early 1900s. And by that time, there had been widespread colonization from European groups throughout a great majority of the world. And so when we look at the ethnographically collected data today of Native American societies, of hunting and gathering populations that are still living some version of their traditional lifeways, there's a small percentage of those groups left that have been analyzed through this Western scientific tradition. In most cases, they're in places that are were not desirable for colonial efforts, either for agriculture or mining or whatever other interests there were. And so they tend to be groups that were more marginal already. So our impression, and sometimes I think our biases of what it means to be a hunter-gatherer or a hunter-gatherer-fisher is based off of relatively marginalized groups from the relatively recent time frame when anthropologists were studying or ethnographers were studying some of these groups. And it's not necessarily reflective of the diversity of lifeways that people would have been experiencing in the past. And I think Florida is a really good example of that, because the lifeways here in Florida, particularly with a great deal of coastal estuary environments which were extremely naturally abundant, in some of those places, in very unique settings, we have excellent preservation. One of the, Steve was mentioning Little Salt Spring, which is an earlier site, but the site of Windover up in Brevard County, which was a mortuary site in a slow-moving slough, kind of peat bog, which resulted in incredibly good preservation of human skeletal material, including brain tissue, woven fabric that's over 8,000 years old, on the undersides of some of these burials. And so in these, Key Marco, which Steve just mentioned to me, Marco Island today, artifacts that have been parts of nets, bowls, masks, some of which are illustrated beautifully in Ted's work. In most contexts, that material completely disintegrates. In hunting and gathering populations as well, cemeteries are less common. Steve made this comment that it just got triggered again in my head, but the concept of what is a grave good. So when people are buried, both in our own time and in times past, often we, depending on your own spirituality and religious practices, often we put someone in their nicest clothes. We make decisions about what will be interred with that person or not interred with that person. Sometimes jewelry is, other times people are like, no, wait, give me that ring. But those decisions are being made by the people, not the person who's passed away, but by the people around them that are engaging in whatever sort of ceremonial activity there is. And in some Native American contexts, particularly among agricultural populations where we have agricultural populations are more sedentary, and so we have cemeteries, where people are living in a village context year-round. You have a nearby cemetery that serves as a mortuary disposal place. And we can see finely crafted objects. In fact, most of the things in the archaeological record, as Steve was making the point of with his spear point that gets repaired so many times until it's too small to function in that original capacity, and now it gets transferred into something else, and by the time it's broken, it's being discarded in an active village. We find those complete, beautifully worked, often personal adornment items in burial contexts rather than in daily life discard kinds of contexts. And because cemeteries are more commonplace for agricultural populations because they're sedentary, we often don't see as many ornaments recovered archaeologically among hunter-gatherers. But that's not a symptom of the productivity or the lifeways of hunter-gatherers. That's a symptom of how archaeology happens and how we have access to parts of the past by virtue of the practices that the people had that allow us to see into their world.
Any more paper
I
questions?
know you.
I got a snap.
All right, Mike's coming back with another.
I'm a loudspeaker. I don't know if you want me to speak loudly.
Yeah.
Rich Bottorff, I'm an educator in Manatee County schools.
Great.
I'm a stinker, Choctaw.
Wow.
Looking up and saying this morning that I'm glad the sun is out today and I get to enjoy it like we all are. And I'm a kidder. I disagree with the artist on one note that he'd mentioned about his pieces, saying I like doing profiles, yet so that they're not doing something. Because if they do an act of something, then they start communicating. And so that was interesting that you said it that way. I see each of your pieces, including the profiles, they have to be doing something, as we always are doing something, even if we're doing nothing.
Of course.
The beads comment, I think was the piece that's up here with several beads around the ornament. And being engulfed in trying to understand the process of the past tribes, they could have very well have been doing some farming of fish and farming of different kinds of creatures because of the estuary waters, the differences in the salt of the water of the Gulf and the river that would come in depending on rain. I think they could probably harvest these kinds of beasts, and they would definitely farm the jewels from those, but then they stacked up shells to make homes and sit on that, so it's contradictory. I do love the full picture of your images where you show a setting, and the setting puts me in a place, so that's another judgment, of course, by the artist, but where it was found, maybe you're depicting that. You didn't mention setting, but I'm wondering if that's kind of where you found it, you see the setting, and then you work that in as well.
Well, what I've done is, like, I don't do village scenes and all these people working and doing things. I'm more interested in, you know, in things around them, of course, that have already been done, you might say. And I was just trying to do portraits, and kind of like, you look at them and they come alive, and they, you know, you can actually understand that you've got all this history under your feet. And these were people walking there, you know, thousands of years ago, whatever. So that's all I mean, you know, because of course I do have like the traders, they just came back from the village, but I was, you know, focusing on the family. And, you know, you can make up the story you want to, where they've been, what they've done. Same with the two girls there, you know, like I did the background kind of a darkish, kind of apprehensive color, you might say. And then you can make the story from there, what they're, you know, is it the Europeans, is it another tribe, you know, but like that. I don't want to spell it out because I don't know, and nobody knows. It's just your imagination.
How long does it take you to create one of these paintings?
I hate that question. Well, the answer, of course, is all my life. It takes me, you know.
He's still working on that one.
Yeah, could be. Because he did say, well, he didn't know how the feather cape was attached, whether it was like straps or, you know, and I didn't put anything on there because at that point I was so paranoid. Nothing on there is that I invented, you know. So, how long does it take? Well, some take, some are faster than others, of course. Like that Birdman probably took me 3 or 4 months. Now I can probably do painting in, you know, 2 weeks, you know, whatever, depending on size and complications.
Do you still listen to archaeologists, or are you done with us?
I'm pretty well done with them, yeah. I mean, you know, what I use, the beads and stuff like that, it's all pretty common now. If I'm doing a new painting that I'm not quite sure about, I'll contact like I did you, and, you know, and say, well, will this be used for this or whatever, is that possible? And they come back like, Teresa said, no, it'll never be used for that, it was strictly a tool, like that sort of thing. But no, it's I know pretty much now. When I started, I knew nothing about these tribes. So it's been a good journey.
What do you think you've conveyed to the public about the tribes of Florida through your work that's been exhibited widely?
Well, I know some of the places I went, there's like second, third generation Floridians never even knew these people existed. And they got like really excited about, oh wow, this is our tribe in our area, and you know, for hundreds of years, you know, they've been you've been walking right in their place, and they never knew about it. So, yeah, that's very satisfying. Other than that, you know, it's just basically, you know, to make them come alive. Does that kind of answer the question? What?
There's no right answer to that.
Oh, I know, there's no right answer. No answer.
I think the awareness of existence is really powerful for me, because when you walk down Sarasota, when you walk on the beach, when you walk on a low mound, when you go to Philippia State Park and walk on the Shumbin that you really can't even see, you don't even have any perception of what was there before you. So when you can see an active village like this, I mean, I And everybody says, oh, what's your favorite one? I mean, I don't know if I have a favorite one, but I'm drawn to that one on the beach. I can hear the wind. I can hear the surf. I can feel the sting of the salt in my eyes that he is feeling. And I wonder, who is he there to meet and what is he there to do, is what brings my mind. So it invokes me. Sometimes I get chills with the feelings that are invoked because it has so much depth of meaning, and that's what revelations are, whether they be secular or religious. It is a rush, a tornado that comes up through you and bursts out of your head in goosebumps. And those are the kind of things that when I mean, I can hear that person waving and yelling to somebody. It looks like up in the air, like they're in a bar, or in a Spanish shipwreck or something, although they may have been throwing arrows at him. But I'm trying to think of how he would be. What is he waving at that he's looking up when he's on the ground level? So I try to think. So there is a lot of activity. They may not be specific activity. It may not be, okay, they're doing a corn dance or a ceremonial burial or something, but every one of these has activities. The man with the bowl looking up to the heavens, there's a lot of serenity, and it's very peaceful, and I feel calm and peaceful when I look at that. And he's looking up to the heavens. Is there an offering going on there? You say you don't have any activity going on, but it looks like there's a serenity and an offering to that that is invoked.
So we have archaeologists and artists up here, but what about Native Americans weighing in? So Ted, have you ever approached, now many people here I'm sure know that most of the indigenous tribes of Florida in their cultural and biological form did not survive the transition of Florida into transition from Spanish to British, back to Spanish, and ultimately an American territory. And it was a very dynamic, changing landscape. But there are indigenous peoples in Florida, and there are indigenous peoples that are descendant from the Appalachians. So have you contacted any of those groups, and have you interfaced with them and gotten feedback from them about your artwork?
The answer is no.
Why?
Well, for example, you know, the Seminole over there, Billy Bowlegs, I showed that exhibit. I took his figure from a etching from the New York Times, you know, back in 1800s, 1840s or whatever, and he was wearing a shirt that had no design on it. And so I got an email from this Seminole saying, Billy Bowlegs would never wear a shirt like that, and he's got to have a pattern on it, you know. So eventually I did put the pattern on. But the advantage of doing these people is that they don't call me and say, that's wrong. So I have some leeway there. And I suppose I could go to Cuba and actually talk to some descendants of these people that used to be here and were now in Cuba. But no, I really haven't. I don't want to, my stuff is more like, I want it to be like scientific. I want it to be accurate. And people can make up their own stories of what's going on, and I worry about composition, color, all that sort of thing, the usual art things. And I don't want, you know, I don't sit there and say, well, I'm going to do this because I'm sure he's thinking about that, or he's about to do this. It's like, I don't do that. It's all like art is art and science together, and it makes the picture that you can look at and feel that it's the real deal.
And Steve, how many Native Americans do you work with in your archaeological work?
Now, very few. When I worked at the Picayune Strand, there was a woman who was Native American who was an archaeologist. There aren't many Native American archaeologists, and it is nice to communicate, and it would be nice to have someone representing the Seminole tribe in an event like this, because that's a good idea to get how they feel. So I haven't worked with a lot of archaeologists, Indians. We have consulted with tribes when we're working on sites. I know that the manager of the Historical Resources, Rob Bendis, his former position was the State Historic Preservation Officer in Tallahassee. I know that they interact and interface with the tribes all the time when burials are found, when sites are disturbed. There is an archaeological trend to consult tribes and individual Indians on archaeological work. Many of the Indians might say, and I know the Seminoles have, is if you want to find out about us, come and talk to us and we'll tell you. Don't dig up our ancestors. And that's a very good point. The human remains at Little Salt Spring, during the 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, the Middle Archaic interred their brethren underwater in sawgrass sloughs and marshes. That was, why is that? That's another thing to think about, is why did that happen? And there are some theories that I won't talk about because it's rather lengthy. But why? Would the Seminole know? They don't want to be underwater with and I cannot speak in any way. But it would be nice to have them more involved in some of our work.
So I put them both on the spot, but I think it reinforces the point that anthropology and archaeology as a discipline comes from a Western scientific tradition. And it may be assumed that there's a much more collaborative effort between archaeologists and the people that they study, or the representatives today of American Indian groups that can speak in a different way for some of those groups, that there would be much more collaboration in it. And it's not really the case. This term consultation is a legislated term. We legislate how various aspects of government, like the State Historic Preservation Office or like the county's historic preservation program, interface directly with American Indian groups and who it is that is able to come to the table, federal recognition of Native American tribes. And so it's a much more complicated backstory that I just, I didn't mean to put them quite on the spot, but obviously they both were like, ooh. So who, does anybody have a question that they want to pose to the panel?
Did Mike?
Yeah, yep, I got it. It was how long does it take to create a painting? Yes?
I don't understand how all the other Indians, the group, died. And I do know that Europeans came over and brought diseases and all this kind of stuff, and it was a tough life. How did the Seminoles, who weren't even from Florida, who came down into Florida, how did they survive the anything?
Well, that is a very complicated question that I'm going to give you like the Cliff Notes, minute and a half version of an answer. Epidemic disease was probably not the prime driver of indigenous population loss in most of South Florida, because epidemic disease requires dense populations. You have epidemic disease where you have population density. Most of the peninsula part of Florida stayed in indigenous leadership until the early 1700s. The Spanish had established a mission system across northern Florida, and while there was some population loss, we don't have good scientific evidence of what it was that drove that. It could have been political change, economic disruption, increased hostility, some impact from disease, but we don't have a good handle on that because many of our records from the historic time period relate upon a European group having a direct interface with an indigenous population. And since most of the peninsula was cut off from that interaction, we don't then have those written records that we rely upon to tell us parts of that story. In the early 1700s, the mission system in northern Florida fell apart, and slave raiding became a common practice and drove down deep into the peninsula. The Seminole tribe, or what became the Seminole tribe, retreated into the Everglades and adapted to a new environment, in part in response to some of the colonial issues that were happening around them, including Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy. So there was a lot going on. That's the Cliff Notes version. But we would be happy to give you a more thorough answer, I think, after, if you want. So if nobody else has any other question, I'm gonna, oh, yes?
Just one, back, I don't know, 30 years ago or so, indigenous bones were found on Manasota Key. And I remember at that time, they consulted the Seminole, and the Seminole said they weren't their bones, but they didn't want them put in a museum. They wanted them reburied. What all went on there exactly? Or how old were the bones?
I'll let Steve address how old the bones were, but I'll just make a quick comment first. So 30 years ago, what's that, 1987?
89.
No, it's 2017.
Well, no, I'm saying that the excavation.
It was in 1989. Okay, so, well, anyway, that was, thank you, Steve. So 30,
28.
yeah, okay, so 27 years ago. In 1990, there was major federal legislation passed called the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. We use the acronym NAGPRA to refer to this legislation. Before NAGPRA, different states had various ways that they treated human remains, but it was not unusual in the United States of America up until the 1980s to have a cemetery that would include multiple ethnic groups, including Native Americans, recovered either from, occasionally the Mississippi River floods and you get, the disinterment of individuals in historic cemeteries along river valleys, for example, or a road construction project that's going to disturb a cemetery. If it was African American remains or Euro-American remains, they would be reburied in appropriate fashion. If it was Native American remains, they would go to a museum collection. And this legislation in 1990 literally evened the playing field. And it's kind of embarrassing as an anthropologist to think that only less than 30 years ago we began treating the ancestral remains of American Indians equivalently with other ethnic populations in the United States. So I'll just make that comment, and then I'm going to turn it over to Steve to answer your more specific questions about the Manasota Key Cemetery.
In terms of dating, the Manasota Key Cemetery was around AD 2 to 700, approximately. And there was a couple radiocarbon dates that were older than that. There was a feature that was a little older. The Seminole tribe did come out for that, and they spent a day. And I'm not sure exactly the dialogue that I wasn't involved in the dialogue between that visit. I know that the material is protected, and I knew that there was some reinterment slated for them. I believe the presence of them are still at the Division of Historical Resources, and I do believe that someone is doing some types of studies on them, but I can't be specific because I'm not sure. The point earlier about the archaic cemetery was the point that I was going to make before I went off on the fact that the Archaic interred their folks underwater, was that all those burials are protected. The University of Miami has been protecting those. There's no active excavations of any human remains at Little Salt Spring. They're all protected. And I think most human remains are protected now unless they're threatened. So threatened remains, depending on why they're threatened, and that's when consultation comes in with Native Americans to find the best solution for the remains once they're disturbed. And if avoidance is always the most reasonable factor, but in interment, reinterment, and the excavation and reinterment, I know happens quite a bit as well. If you encounter them in a construction site and it's not possible to stop the construction site. So there are ways to to handle that, and that all falls onto NACRA and in consultation, as Teresa mentioned.
So I remember that they just reburied them and built a house on top? No?
I'm not sure.
I built the house anyway.
That particular scenario is unlikely, but not that it didn't happen before that. Federally recognized tribes in a given state are the ones that have a voice at the table in terms of consultation. So if there is descendants of a group that is not federally recognized, they don't have the same power at the table as a group that is. But I'll also mention that there are different cultural traditions for tribes across the United States of America, and in some cases, select tribes think that the soul of the person leaves the body at death, and so the remains are not significant. And so there are places in the United States where scientific analysis of human remains is still allowed through the consultation process, and in other places there is not. And it really does depend much more heavily on tribal traditions, but that's not to equate it with the tribal traditions of the people that have been disinterred necessarily, just because of the legalities of the law. Does anybody else have another question? Yes, Rich?
Did you ever find cenotes to be a part of their civilizational areas? Kind of like the Mayan has cenotes where the fresh water's in the limestone, and we have these kinds of areas throughout Florida, springs and things, to be a part of their placement of their civilization area.
To take an example of a cenote, Little Salt Spring, could talk about more mineral springs as well. They were attracted to Little Salt Spring for resources and potentially because of, origin myths. Little Salt Spring is kind of a magic, spooky place. And it also provided a resource area for people to go to. So it was attractive to collect items. It's also a mortuary pond. It's one of 5 or 6 known mortuary ponds in the state. So people were traveling to Little Salt Spring to inter their brethren, and in a ritual fashion. So why there? Was it just because it was, or was it because it was, it had meaning? It's a geological feature that persists through time. Were they giving offerings on the bottom like the Mayan did in certain cenotes? We don't really know. And we haven't excavated, a number of burials. I have never worked on a burial at Little Salt Spring, although I know they're there. I know where they're disarticulated. So I've excavated primarily in the Archaic period below the burials or in non-burial areas. So I'm sure they had some significance, but I don't know of any large Florida civilization based on the proximity to a cenote. However, large civilizations form around seep springs, water sources, for the availability of water. Every large mound has some type of spring area, of lake area. So I would say that springs had meaning. Springs had, potential magic meaning, if that's even a word. Archaeologists don't usually use magic, but
We might use magic, but we don't write about it.
So I think that, the springs had great meaning, potentially like they did. But we don't know that there are large populations. There's no evidence of large populations. There is a midden site associated with Little Salt Spring. It seems relatively sparse. People have called it village sites. It doesn't seem to be a village. It could be redundant visitations over 1,000 years or 2,000-year period where families are going to camp to procure resources. Could be some of the same people over and over again, same families, extended families, generationally. Or it could be groups that are just coming in and a spring is just part of their resource procurement round or their visitation round. You know, I used to say it's like the Motel 6 of North Point. People know where they are. They've always been, they've been there since the dawn of time.
I think since we can all go home and turn on our taps in our kitchen, we lose sight of just how much life would have to revolve around water if we didn't have that ability. People can live for 7 days without any food, but they can live for 100 hours without water. So the significance is functional, but it probably also played a much bigger role in terms of meaning on the landscape that, as Steve said, we can't see archaeologically. Does anybody else have another question? Yes?
Just a technical question about how you draw these figures. Do you ever use models, or do you reference any of the Spanish imagery that was created at the time of contact, or is it all speculative, hairstyles and physiognomy, etc.?
Great question.
Yes and yes. It's my vision of what they look like, somewhere between the South American Indians and the North American Indians. So that's what I've tried to get for as far as facial structures. I usually use photographs for everything. The faces I like to copy, like the early black and white photographs of the Western Indians, and the bodies I use models, of course, and some I just pick up from different places, and if we need an arm there, or a leg there, or it's like Frankenstein type stuff going on. But the bottom line is, you make it all work together, but it's all, I don't know too many artists that can just like whip them out without even looking at, some kind of reference. But I imagine there's some, not me. I need positive things to look at.
I think that raises a really interesting point, actually, that I'll give an example and then I'll ask Ted to speak to. So in historic preservation, and I know Sarasota County has a number of incredibly significant and beautiful buildings, we have a tendency to preserve the pretty. So if it's kind of a fugly historic structure, it's a harder effort to get public support for its preservation. Some other artists, Ted and I haven't necessarily had this specific conversation, but another artist named Merrill Clark, who used to he would do the murals for the Florida Museum of Natural History. He said that he would have to fight the curators to include older individuals because they were considered to be less attractive. The Native American people that are illustrated are wearing less clothing, so people have a tendency to be pretty fit, pretty attractive, and a fairly narrow age range. So to what degree has that interfaced or influenced your artwork?
Well, I have done older people, and they seem to sell very well, so people like them. But basically, I think of the Indians as their food supplies. They're like very healthy because they eat shellfish and deer, and so I make them look healthy. I think they would be, and they probably were very athletic because they moved around a lot and did things. So that's basically the answer. Just my idea of their diet would make them look like they do.
I don't know if that's true. I'm sure there's probably a lazy Calusa or two. Versus a bunch of supermodel Calusa.
But you don't want that image out there because they'd be like laughing instead of.
Well, so that we have Ted has said to me before that he rarely shows people smiling, open-mouthed. And you want to talk about why that is?
Well, there it is, an expression that we've never seen. Of course, there's nothing written about them having a good time laughing and joking around. And also, it just kind of trivialized, right? Trivialize. Them, if I make them sit there and they're smiling, it's like, what are they smiling at me for, These, I want to make them so you can walk up and they're like looking you in the eye and saying, you know, we were here once, you know, and we were real people, not smiling people necessarily, or fat people, or whatever. It's just, you know, we were people, and we had a great culture until the Europeans came.
Yes.
I agree with Steve. When I look at Ted's paintings, I can feel them, as like you said, and I imagine what they're doing. And to me, yes, I see the artifacts and I see their beads, their jewelry, and their tools and stuff, which can put it all together. But I also see their way of life, and that's, to me, that makes me want to know more about them. So.
Thank you, that's excellent. Does anybody else have a question they want to throw out at the panel? Well, we are happy to stay and answer more questions and mingle. I'll let each of them make a closing comment. I'll let. Here, Steve, please make a closing comment.
Thank you. I'll just thank you all for coming. I think this has been great. I think we're very, very fortunate, the Friends of the History Center, to have such a premier exhibit here. There's going to be lots of stuff happening, hopefully in the near future, in this building, and hopefully Sarasota County Historical Resources. We've got a lot of things going on, and I also want to thank Teresa for spending her day with us. I think this is we have two very special guests with us today. Well, everyone is a special guest today. Thank you all for coming. But for Teresa to come up and take a look at the brochure, at the catalog, take a look at the gift store. I know I'm going to join the Friends of the History Center today. I brought my checkbook, and I don't mean to be negligent, but I haven't joined yet because they're doing great things here. Take a look at the catalog. Teresa is going to leave some. There is a modest price for them. And Ted also has some great works out there. So I just wanted to say thanks. I've been really excited about coming up here today, and it turned out really nice. Thank you.
Now, I just want to say it's been a great journey for me doing all these people. It's like family. So that's about it.
Family that you'd be willing to part with, right?
Well, I could only get new family members.
Thank you all so much, and we do encourage you to come on up and ask Ted and Steve questions, and I'll stick around as well, and we just really appreciate you coming out today.